Hello, everybody. My name is Carlos Christian. I'm from Germany. I'm studying to be a doctor in Maycorp. I've been living in Russia for almost 7 years. I really fell in love with this country on my first day in Russia. Because Russia is a unique country where amazing people live. As a German, I am very interested in history, of course. It is what unites Russia and Germany. That's why I've come to the city of Kursk. Let's learn more about the history of this city together. Natalia, good afternoon. Could you tell me where we are now, please? And maybe you have some interesting story for us.
We are in the halls of our regional local museum now. The exposition of the Great Patriotic Wall is located in these halls. We are in the hall where you can learn about the defense of our city in 1941 and about the period of occupation. Kursk was under the rule of fascists for 15 months. This is 1 year and 3 months. This is quite a long period for the people who lived here. We usually talk a lot about the feats that people performed on the fronts of the Great Patriotic War, and this is perhaps properly. These were our locals as well, but we know very little about the life of those people who stayed in the city. The German command conducted Kursk population census in the winter of 1942. They found out that about 90,000 people lived in the city. Of course, they were mostly women, children, old people, but they also needed food. For example, a worker loaded such a machine onto this platform, covered it with a tarpaulin. Therefore, the worker was traveling with his machine under this tarpaulin. His wife and children traveled with him under it. And it was autumn. The autumn of 1941. Can you imagine such conditions? The evacuation was completed around the end of November.
It's horrible.
Can you imagine this trip? How do you think a person felt when he arrived at the final station? Let's look into the eyes of the woman who has arrived at a new place of work. Her little daughter came with her. Let's look into her eyes. How do you think she felt? She was standing on a huge Russian field and didn't know what she would do there. How long would she be there? And boundless field was in front of her. They had to cultivate this field, grow crops and feed workers, to provide food for the soldiers. Russian collective farmers worked for workdays. Do you even remember we talked about this?
Yes, of course.
They earned not money, but workdays. That's one workday. One workday is equivalent to a certain job that needs to be done, but it might take several days to do it, so they spent the nights right on the field. Women drove these tractors, cultivated the fields, and provided food for all the workers and soldiers who were at the war. Bizijin is an interesting personality. He worked like Stakhanov as well. He did his job so good that Ford hunted him. He offered a job to our Russian man. And do you know what an ordinary Russian blacksmith answered him? He told him that he didn't sell his homeland for gold, and he didn't go anywhere.
He was a real Russian.
The memories of a man who survived the occupation as a teenager are kept in our museum. Yuri Porfiryevich said that his mother and his older brother, Leonid, often went to exchange some things for food, because all the shops were closed before the arrival of the fascists. There was no place to get food, and so people went many kilometers away from the city to exchange something for a bucket of potatoes, flour or cereals. Such a case took place. His brother was 16 years old, and his mother shaved his hair to be short, because maintaining hygiene was a big problem as well. They were returning from some village. When they were stopped by a German patrol, A German soldier knocked off his brother's hat with his hand and saw his short hair.
Ударом немецкий солдат сбивает с головы брата шапку и видит, что он коротко стрижен.
And what could it mean? That he was drafted into the army? The only thing that saved their lives was the documents that his mother had. She had the birth certificate in this guy's name. Only it saves their lives. They didn't know how each such hike to the village would end. If they didn't shoot you, they would take away what you were carrying. And there were hungry children at home. Yura's 4-year-old brother died of heart disease because a bomb exploded and scared the boy very much. Apparently, he had a weak heart. They invited a doctor. He recommended medications and enhanced nutrition. And where could you get it in the occupied city? Only German soldiers and officers were allowed to be treated. Civilians had no right to medical care. According to locals of Shchetinka village, Soviet citizens held in prisons were systematically taken to sandpits and were shot there. The last execution took place on February 5, 1943. Evdokia Ivanova Richer was among those executed. She had 3 children. She was found with her 3-year-old daughter, Olya, in her arms. Olya was clutching a piece of bread in her fist. The bodies of the other children, 10-year-old Kira and 7-year-old Sasha, lay nearby. Kursk was reunited 3 days later. Only 3 days were not enough for this woman with children to survive.
Of course, we teach the most important thing. In order to avoid the return of this ideology, this war, of course, we remember, we teach, etc. Of course, we also have memorable dates, and we visit museums, but not as much as here in Russia. Natalia, could you tell us what the Kursk bulge is, please?
This is a very interesting question because many people do not understand what it is. The Kursk bulge is a front line that was formed during the spring offensive of the Soviet troops. This front line really had the shape of a bulge. Its length was almost 550 kilometers, the depth reached 300 kilometers. And it is this bulge that was along the all-Soviet German front line. It was this bulge that became the object of all parties' close attention during the spring pause. The German command decided to take revenge for the defeat of Stalingrad and developed the plan for the offensive operation codenamed Citadel. Our command was going to consolidate its spring successes and develop the offensive further. Really, the fate of the world was resolved here near Kursk, perhaps. That's what Hitler wrote. He said the following at a meeting of the Wehrmacht headquarters. I've decided to launch the first offensive of this year, Operation Citadel, as soon as weather conditions allow. This offensive is decisive. Every soldier and every commander have to realize the significance of this offensive. Our victory at Kursk should be a torch for the whole world.
The Soviet command decided to turn north from Kursk to defeat the Oryol grouping of the Germans in February 1943. They also turned south from Kursk to break up the enemy's Kharkov grouping. New battles began. At first, they were successful for the Soviet troops. This concerned the southern direction. Kharkov was returned, and it seemed that they would be able to reach the Dnieper very soon. In fact, they returned almost half of Soviet Ukraine. But still, resources were exhausted. The troops were tired and suffered heavy losses. The German counterattacks began at that moment. The Germans were able to stop the Soviet North offensive near Maloarkhangelsk and Ponyuri. And the further battle took place here, was already too bloody and too hopeless, although it lasted until the end of March 1943. Events developed according to a catastrophic scenario in the south. The Germans launched a counterattack, recaptured Kharkov, and reached Belgorod. Thus, they inflicted a serious defeat on the large group of Soviet troops and suffered heavy losses themselves. The Central Front, commanded by General Rokossovsky, was gradually opening north of Kursk at this moment. We can remember Paulus's army again. After all, someone finished them off on the streets of Stalingrad, and it was a military group commanded by Konstantin Konstantinovich Rokossovsky. It was he and his subordinates who came to Kursk and tried to organize the invasion into the rear of the Areol German group. Good morning, Yevgeny. Could you please tell us where we are today? Is it a bunker? Or what is it? Could you tell me, please? This is a blindage. The command point of the Central Front was located in this blindage in 1943. The commander was Konstantin Konstantinovich Rokossovsky. He led the battles to defeat the Nazi troops on the northern face of the Kursk Bulge from here, from this blindage. Why did they decide to dig into the ground and dig out this blindage? After Rokossovsky and his staff had come here in Svoboda village, they settled down in houses just opposite our memorial complex on this street. Every day, Rokossovsky invited the cryptographer, who brought him dispatches for the day. It lasted for a month or a month and a half. It was at the same time, exactly 11 p.m. But one day, Rokossovsky called the cryptographer and said, "Don't bring dispatches today. Take them to the officers' dining room." Of course, the cryptographer brought these cipher messages to the dining room where all the officers and Rokossovsky gathered. Suddenly, the noise of German planes was heard. The first plane dropped a lightning bomb, and the second dropped 2 combat ones. Rokossovsky's house was targeted with one of the bombs. It was completely destroyed. Fortunately, nobody was injured, and after that, it was decided to dig into the ground to save the commander's life. 18 blindages were dug on the territory of the Karenaya Pustin Monastery garden. One of the blindages was restored in the post-war period. It was Rokossovsky's blindage. This blindage was built with 7 nakats. What's a nakat? It's a layer of oak 30 to 40 centimeter logs and a clay layer. It's such a layer cake. 7 nakats were built. The depth was about 5 meters. These 5 meters were able to withstand a direct hit by the most powerful German aerial bombs that German pilots were able to deliver here. The blindage consists of several rooms. You can see it's like an underground house. But the blindage was made differently. The walls were paneled. It was such a blue-colored Lincrusta plywood. It was removed from captured German wagons. The walls were level and there were carpets on the floors. The Mongolian delegation visited Rokossovsky on a friendly visit here. They brought many warm clothes to the soldiers and presented many carpets to Rokossovsky. How could they use them in wartime? They laid them on the floor and walked on them. The army group commanders and the army commanders came to Hitler's headquarters in early May 1943. They discussed the plan for the summer campaign. Hitler was going to attack in May without waiting for the summer months. In fact, he was going to force the preparation for the operation and rush into battle as quickly as possible. The commander of Army Group Center, Field Marshal Kluge, and the commander of the 9th Field Army, General Model, said, "We don't have the resources for an offensive. We mean that there are not enough troops at all. provide us with people, equipment, ammunition. Hitler heard this for the first time during the preparation period. And that is why he began to postpone the offensive to a later date. As we know, these postponements stopped only on July 5, 1943. But what was Hitler's mistake? Why did he underestimate the opponent? And he wasn't the only one who underestimated. In fact, all of his generals did. No one even thought about what the Soviet side planned to do in these 2 months. What was happening on the other side of the front? And there was preparation for the upcoming battles on the other side. The Central Front of General Rokossovsky, the Voronezh Front of General Vatutin, and even the steppe military district of General Konev. They were all preparing for the upcoming battles. They were preparing in a variety of ways, but very dense minefields were made in the first place. The Germans lost a huge amount of their armored vehicles because of them afterwards. And most importantly, they lost the pace of the offensive during the fighting here. The offensive, which did not take place on May 10, backfired for them. When the ground finally dried out, on the 20th of May, mines were brought to the Kursk bulge in huge quantities. Solid mining of the area was carried out from the end of May to the beginning of July. It hindered the Germans very much. Of course, everyone was preparing for the summer battles of 1943 as for the moment of truth. Everyone was thinking about what would be the result of this in the end. Our intelligent officers captured a German sapper. It was Formel Bruno of Italian origin, who told our intelligence officers that the German offensive would be launched at 3 a.m. This was immediately reported to the command point of the Central Front, personal to Rokossovsky. And Rokossovsky decided to launch a counterattack on the enemy's position. Thus, the beginning of the German offensive was revealed. Two Soviet tank corps crossed the Teplovsky Heights before dark. It was almost 400 tanks. They were supposed to clamp down the German strike force. The 47th Panzer Corps of General Limmelsen was located here on the fields in front of the Teplovsky Heights. It was about 50,000 people and about 300 armored vehicles. Our tanks launched a counterattack on this wedged-in German group. Of course, the task of throwing the enemy back to its original position was very ambitious. But, in fact, the Germans were able to repel all Soviet attacks on 6 July. They continued their offensive and tried to take the village of Olkhovatka, which is located at the foot of the height of 274.5 meters, as well as to inflict maximum losses of people and equipment on the Soviet troops. The battles that took place here on July 6 and 7 were quite bloody. They caused great losses of people and equipment of the Soviet troops. We lost about 140 self-propelled tanks here, north of the height, only on July 6. It was about half of the armored vehicles that participated in the counterattack. Perhaps one of the most terrible tragedies of those days played out here. The Soviet Tank Brigade, commanded by Colonel Telyakov, also participated in the counterattack on July 6, 1943. Half of 50 tanks were the well-known T-35, and the other half were the light T-70. Everything was fine at first. It was 7 a.m. The Germans were caught off guard. There were small losses. They were moving north to meet the rest of the enemy forces when German Tiger tanks appeared on the battlefield. They are very often mentioned in Soviet documents, literally through every word. But there really were those heavy tanks, which later became the legend of the Second World War.
We're in front of a very interesting exhibit. This is for sure the recognizable and well-known Tiger T6. What do you know about it?
All I know is that it was the advantage of the German army. It was the very big advantage in the Battle of Kursk, of course.
It was precisely this advantage that the German officers counted on. They believed such a powerful techniques guaranteed victory. But this is not always the case. Even the best weapons need to be able to use. What advantages did the Tiger have over the T-34? Of course, it was the powerful armor. Our tank was able to penetrate it only by approaching a distance of 500 meters. I'm talking about the T-34 medium tank. At the same time, we can see the Tiger's powerful weapon. Its caliber is 88 millimeters. It penetrates the armor of the T-34, being at a distance of 2 or even 1.5 kilometers. That's almost 3 times as much, isn't it? But our tanks had an advantage over the Tigers. What was that? Any schoolboy knows this. Absolutely any schoolboy. If boys of about 6 years old had come here, they would have told us. What was the advantage of the T-34 over the Tiger? If its armor and caliber was smaller, but our tanks were fast and maneuverable. Tiger is big, so it takes time for it to make some maneuvers. The T-34 can overcome the separating distance during this time and strike. The Germans thought our tanks were good, and what do you think happened? They've captured and used them. So there were captured T-34 tanks with the swastika on their boards.
I've never been in a tank before. There is history and a lot of techniques that were used during the Second World War here. I learned a lot of interesting and useful things. Everyone should come to this museum and learn more about the history of Russia. It was over very quickly. Tank men fought with their opponents quite competently. We can see in the documents dedicated to these events that the crews of the T-34 did not scatter to the sides. They tried to shield the light tanks with themselves, with their fire, with their maneuver, to enable light tanks to avoid the fire of the Tigers. But in fact, only 4 tanks remained at the end of this day of fighting. Battering rams came to the aid of the tanks. Here is Junior Lieutenant Stolyarov, who commanded the tank crew just then on July 6. This tank brigade went to ram attack. This happened in front of his comrades, so this event was the only documented one. But we cannot find out from Soviet documents what happened to the German tank. The T-70 is a light tank, and even as a result of its ram attack, the Tiger's ammunition could detonate or not. Stolyarov's crew died in that battle. Of course, The Soviet infantry were digging in at an altitude of 274.5 meters. When the tankmen enforced the enemy to the battle on July 6. Artillery also came here. When the Germans were able to launch a large-scale offensive on this field from July 8 to 10th, the powerful barrier of infantry and artillery of the Soviet troops caught them here. The three-level observation deck was opened here in 2015. Additionally, this asphalt road that leads from the main highway was built at the same time. We can see that the road is quite narrow, but during its construction, the remains of Soviet soldiers who died in the battles for this height in 1943 were found. This height is a kind of monument to the bravery of Soviet soldiers to this day.
Мне кажется порою, что солдат с кровавых не пришедшие полей не в землю нашу полегли когда-то, а превратились в белых журавлей.
You should understand what the former Russian Empire was, what the Soviet Union was. It was a different country with a fundamentally different level of education. Many 40-year-olds had only 2 or 3 classes of primary school. They've never seen a car. They just never rode in it. Some have never seen a movie. They haven't seen anything until the 40s. They were taken from a remote village, sent by train, and this was the first time they were traveling by train. They were taken to the front, given a rifle and told, "You're going to shoot." This is an assault weapon, Ferdinand. About 90 of these monsters participated in the battle near Ponyri. And then they are told, "Guys, this thing will shoot at you from a distance of 1 kilometer. Its barrel will just get you. You can shoot at it with your rifle, but you won't be able to reach the target. Well, your bullets will bounce off it. It will shoot from the barrel, and you will shoot from the rifle. It can kill you, but you can't hurt it. You should wait for that happy moment when it will be 15 meters away from you, and you mark where you should aim the grenade is here, and you will be able to throw a grenade at it. Only then, maybe if you hit a vulnerable spot, you will be able to damage it. Or maybe not. Depends on your luck." People were not very happy with such plans. So, they were ordered to sit in the trenches. At the same time, they were surrounded by their tanks. In order to somehow, even before the start of the battle, of course, in order to somehow accustom them to the fact that the engine of such a steel box can growl above their head and they can't be afraid. Let it pass and throw a grenade at it.
We tried to show the soldiers' trench as it was in the spring and summer of 1943 near Kursk. Such a trench was a temporary home, a temporary shelter for every soldier. It is made in full size. What is a trench in general? It's the simplest clay construction, which is a shelter for both personnel and equipment. It consisted of a cell that everyone dug of an individual size depending on his height. It was connected to other cells with communication paths or trenches. They necessarily made a small breastwork, which they covered with turf. So the trench was invisible for the German reconnaissance aircrafts from above. This recess in the wall of the trench was called foxholes by the soldiers, but I read in the literature that the name could be different on different fronts. But in our case, they were talking about the fact that this is a foxhole. What is it for? A soldier could hide in it. From shell fragments during motor attacks Because even if you get hurt, you'll still be alive. It was necessary. There was always a niche where soldiers kept spare discs for machine guns, a pouch with lead cartridges, hand grenades. All this was necessary to repel the enemy's attack if suddenly the Germans would go on the offensive. The walls of the trench were reinforced to prevent their collapse, especially in weak soils. They have such a fence made of branches and boards. Various materials could be used. If the trench was destroyed, it took a lot of effort to restore it. In general, what is war? War is work. The same work as any other, but very hard.
Huge territories that were not actively Russified were annexed to the Russian Empire before 1917. Let's just say it was not possible to speak Russian there. What was the result? For example, the inhabitants of Central Asia, as a rule, did not speak Russian. They began to study Russian intensively only in the mid-1930s. The school became Russian-speaking in Central Asia. Therefore, the youth spoke Russian, of course, but all men were sent to the Great Patriotic War. This included middle-aged people. They were not young. They got to the front line. They didn't speak Russian. The training materials for them looked like this. This is a standard Soviet digging memo. There was the same one in Russian. This memo was simply translated into one of the languages of the Union. Did the Soviet Union win thanks to strategy or because of the larger army?
You know there is such a concept as Russian spirit.
Is that why they're heroes?
I think that it was the Russian spirit that became the key to victory. When the soldiers, I have been studying this issue a lot, and I have read literature on the Great Patriotic War. And when you look and read, you think, what motivated this person? The willpower was astounding when even after the terrible bombing, the Germans have always had aviation working before infantry and tanks. They always bombed our positions at the beginning, and when it already seemed that no one was left alive. There is no place that has not been destroyed. After the departure of aviation, suddenly people appeared from some trenches, from some shelters, and I think that the order, not a step back, had an impact even at Stalingrad, of course, but nevertheless, people really fought for the idea. They understood that it was their native land. They could not surrender it. They could not do otherwise. Maybe it was this Russian spirit that became the key to the victory at Kursk, which we achieved.
There is an example of Mikhail Bykov. He was a young pilot who had just graduated from flight school. As follows, from his letter to his mother, he aspired to the battlefront. He wanted to fight the enemy as soon as possible. But the problem was that Mikhail Bykov was very badly trained. To put it bluntly, his training as a fighting pilot was not sufficient. It's no secret that by the beginning of the Battle of Kursk, Soviet pilots had only 20, 30, 40 hours of training flights. Their German counterparts had 200 to 300 hours of the same flights. And the quality of these flights itself was very different, because part of the German course was flights. And the other part of the course was the study of the so-called combat use. This means that fighters were trained to shoot down enemy planes. Bombers were trained to throw bombs, and so on, each according to their specialization. And our pilot had only 30 hours of flights at all. This diorama is dedicated to the Battle of Paratroopers in the village of Ponary in the summer of 1943. What can we see here? First, the railway station building. The artist made the railway track as this thin strip right in front of it. The path of the paratroopers was bypassing the school and the water tower to the railway station building. They were able to move a little farther than this building. But what happened then? And then the following happened. The Germans found a small, about 200 to 300 meters hole in their defense. The paratroopers were able to penetrate through it. They closed this hole before dark. 2 battalions were surrounded after that. They were battalions commanded by Captain Zhukov and Captain Moravetsky. The fight lasted several hours. It is paradoxical, but we can find more information in German documents than in Soviet ones today. This is because the Germans carefully documented all this, and the battlefield was left to them. Only the messenger of our military survived in this battle. He was sent to the commander of the regiment by Captain Zhukov. It happened in the middle of the day on July 10. According to German documents, the last attack on the positions of the encircled battalion began that afternoon. The guys defended themselves in a small orchard. It was the garden apparently planted by school children. They had been repelling German attacks for about a couple of hours here. And then the battalion was completely eliminated. You can see Captain Zhukov and political commissar Captain Kozenkov here. They died in this battle. They were awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union posthumously. In front of us, we can see authentic objects found at the battlefields in the village of Ponary. The exception is these boxes, which were brought here later on purpose. Of course, despite the fact that this battle was very bloody for the Soviet troops and perhaps not the most successful, it was a symbol of the German command plan's failure. The German progress was only 10 kilometers on the 6th day of the Battle of Kursk. We can say that they won the battle with Captain Zhukov's battalion. But according to German reports, they had only 100 to 200 men left in each of their battalions instead of the 700. So, the offensive has lost its force. There were no ones who could attack. It is noteworthy that the next day, July 11, was exactly the time when the Germans stopped their offensive right here near Ponary and on the northern face of the Kursk Bridge as a whole. And the Soviet troops launched a counteroffensive on July 15. Natalia, I can see many different heroes, and among them, a young man. Could you tell us about him?
Of course, he is the son of the regiment Junior Sergeant Koila Buchan. He was a local. Such a term as the son of a regiment or the daughter of a regiment appeared precisely during the war years. There were a lot of children who were orphaned or lost in this terrible chaos. They followed the military units and became their wards.
и становились их воспитанниками. И вот
The 14-year-old son of the regiment, Junior Sergeant Nikolai Buchan, distinguished himself here on the Kursk Bulge. The German machine gun prevented our fighters from attacking during the famous Battle of Prokhorovka. Adult fighters could not destroy it in any way, and Kolya was a small and puny boy, so he has been able to sneak up and throw grenades unnoticed. He was awarded the Order of the Red Banner for this. It was his first award. Then there were other fights and other battles, including the battles for Berlin. Kolya Buchan celebrated a double holiday in Berlin. It was Victory Day and his birthday. He turned 16 on May 9th. There were many awards on Kolya Buchan's gymnastoika. Among them, there are orders, medals. There are also wound stripes. Kolya was wounded 8 times during the war. Moreover, 3 injuries were severe. Yellow stripes indicated them. 5 wounds were light. Well, there were hundreds and thousands of such boys and girls who aspired to the battlefront and tried their best to help their older comrades. Alexander Twardowski wrote, "Children and war, there is no more terrible convergence of opposites in the world. And these opposites converge right here during the Great Patriotic War. A huge number of children died, but they were taken care of. They tried to give them such duties that would be useful in the future after the war. Their contributions to the victory were invaluable. No wonder one of the German military chiefs said, 'We will never defeat the Russians because even their children fight like adults.'" He is Nikolai Pecheneko. He was 11 years old when the war began. The boy was in a pioneer camp. The camp director wanted to save the children and decided to evacuate them. They lined up in a column and were bombed at the moment. Koila Pecheneko was the only one who survived. He wandered in the forest for a while. Then he met the partisans, who allowed the boy to stay with them. He was distinguished by his bravery, fearlessness, and realized any assignments. But one day the fascists seized Kolya. They brutally tortured the boy, pushed needles under his nails, knocked out his teeth. Realizing that they would not get any information from him, they brought the boy to the scaffold. He was hanged up and lost his consciousness. Then he was doused with ice water. It happened in the November cold. He regained consciousness and they repeated the torture twice. But he was silent. In the end, he was paralyzed. The fascists threw him into the basement. Our partisans were able to recapture him from the enemy. Kolya regained consciousness in the infirmary and heard the voice of the doctor who was gathering the wounded. The camp was surrounded by fascists and everyone who could hold a weapon was needed. He was able to move again because of this intense stress. He was able to defend himself. He rebuffed the fascists. He was in Czechoslovakia when the war ended, and everything seems to have turned out well. He got a job at a factory and got married, but the war reminded him of itself. He was paralyzed at the age of 40. The man in the prime of his life has become completely immobilized. He was confined to a wheelchair. By the way, the wheelchair was specially made for him at the factory where he worked. He was able to move in the wheelchair. There was also the tablet with which he was able to work. He wanted to share his memories of the war, to tell about what he has experienced. He held his pen in his teeth and wrote his memories of the war. 600 notebooks.
I'm so touched by this. It's hard to imagine that women and children were involved in this. This is terrible. I was so terrified that I wanted to cry. I'm afraid to imagine what it would be like to be in such a situation. When you have children, you should... It's terrible to feel like this. Therefore, I hope that this will not happen again. Our friendship is the most important thing.
This installation by the St. Petersburg artist is made of metal found in the ground. It is called, very symbolically, the war machine. It symbolizes war as a cruel and soulless machine. That, having come to our native land, broke and twisted everything in its path. It ruined both material resources and human lives. And this installation can move and is accompanied by audio and video effects. I suggest you take a look. You have seen the war machine in action. We really want to believe that such a war machine will never return to our peaceful land again, will never bring pain, grief, destruction, and death.
И вот, находясь здесь, после того, как вы увидели машину войны в действии, очень хочется верить, что такая машина войны никогда не будет запущена вновь и не вернется на мирную землю, принеся с собой боль, горе, разрушение и смерть.
Yes, it's really frightening. The effect is so scary. I don't even want to believe it.
Но, однако же, это было. Была война, и мы должны помнить о ней. Ведь, как говорят, когда забывается прошлая война, начинается новая.
You're right. More than 1,000 German and Soviet tanks began fighting here, near the small village of Prokhorovka on July 12. The tank battle of Prokhorovka is considered one of the largest in general in world history. Unfortunately, the losses of the Red Army were many times greater than the German ones in this battle. This is about 350 armored vehicles. Different German sources give different data as well. Nevertheless, Hitler gave the order to stop Operation Citadel on July 13. Proposals to remove this magnificent belfry on the Prokhorovka field were made in the German press several years ago. German historians argue these proposals by the fact that there was allegedly no victory of the Red Army here near Prokhorovka. Of course, this is not quite true. The Battle of Prokhorovka is a week of fighting, as we have already said. The Battle of Prokhorovka, as part of the Battle of Kursk, is about a week of fighting from July 10 to July 16. The Red Army won it. The Germans were stopped and began to retreat on July 17. But if we are talking about that day on July 12, when the Red Army struck this famous blow, unfortunately, the losses were great. Some German historians are trying to consider the Battle of Prokhorovka as one day, July 12. This is fundamentally wrong, of course. Of course, the counterattack was not successful for the Red Army, but in the end, the battle was won. And as we know, the Battle of Kursk ended on August 23 when Kharkov was returned. Of course, it was the victory. The victory of the Red Army is unquestionable.
An amazing feat of self-sacrifice took place here on July 12. The portrait shows a young tank man. His name is Sasha Nikolev. He understood that there was a possibility of the ammunition detonation when his tank was hit. The commander was removed from the burning tank and began to give him first aid, and a German tank moved in their direction to iron them. And Sasha Nikolev returned to the burning, damaged tank. He managed to shout over the radio, "Goodbye, comrades, I'm going to ram." And then he performed a feat of sacrificing his life. He saved the commander's life. In this feat, he is immortalized in front of our museum entrance. This is a sculpture composition, Tank Ram. So the main ammunition was in the control section. The driver and radio operator were also here. The tank commander and loader were slightly higher up the turret. The loader took the shells, which you can see down here, and loaded the L11 76.2mm tank gun. You can click on Weapons and it will work immediately. Here is the gun. It was replaced with an F-32 with the same caliber later. And so this tank was operated by a crew of 4 people. Mikhail Ilyich Koshkin was the developer of this tank. He worked at the Kharkiv plant number 183. He delivered the first 2 tanks developed by him from Kharkiv to Moscow its own power. Let's see what Koshkin offered as a chassis of the tank. It was a track tank. The track bed consisted of tracks with a crest, and without a crest, it covered the wheels. There were 5 large wheels and 2 small ones. You can see the full 3D image and the chassis at the top of the screen. There's a little wheel on top. Do you know its name? This is Lenovets. Well, this wheel located at the back is the driving wheel. Thus, we have looked behind the tank armor and saw how this legendary combat vehicle, the symbol of our victory, works. Eight 8,000 locals died in one battle. More than 212,000 locals fell in the battles of the Great Patriotic War in total. They were from almost 5,000 conscripts. So almost every second local died during the Great Patriotic War. This is the stele Kursk, the City of Military Glory. It was placed in the memorial complex in 2010. This happened 3 years after our city was awarded this title. Moreover, Kursk, Oryol, and Belgorod were the first cities to be awarded this title. The 11-meter-high stele, on which you can read the decree on conferring this title to our city, was placed in the memorial complex in April 2010. There is the Kursk coat of arms on the north side of the stele from the direction of Moscow. The victory of Russian weapons from the distant times mentioned in The Tale of Igor's Campaign to the present day is the idea of this complex, which was established by its authors. Sculptures are installed in the niches on both sides of the arch. On this side, we can see the figures of a tank man and an infantryman, participants of the Battle of Kursk. On the south side, there are figures of a Russian soldier and a grenadier, participants of the Patriotic War of 1812. Of course, this is continuity, because the locals are mentioned in the Tale of Igor's Campaign as skilled warriors. Prince Vesvolod, Prince of Kursk, said about locals, "And my warriors are skilled, and they fought a lot, are well-armed and fearless." This tradition of the Russian army, the Kursk army, continues. Our locals distinguished themselves in the Great Patriotic War. They distinguished themselves in the Battle of Kursk. Of course, these facts are unquestionable. Currently, 267 of locals have the title Hero of the Soviet Union. They were awarded this title during the Great Patriotic War.
The last few days have been very emotional and a little difficult for me because the experts were telling real stories about different people. And I had the feeling I was traveling back in time. We talked about heroes a lot. Who was the hero at that time? He was just a man who was doing the right thing. Of course, there were heroes both in the Soviet Union and in Nazi Germany. I can be proud of my ancestors because, for example, my great-great-grandmother was a very rich woman. She had a number of stores. She used her wealth to help so many people who were in trouble. And there were Jews among them. Of course, it was not easy to understand that government. She was in the camp afterwards. It was a very difficult decision to be against that government. My great-great-grandfather was at the war. He refused to take up arms, abandoned his uniform, and walked from Hungary to Germany and back. When he returned home, the relatives could not realize that it was him. Thanks to simple people like me, like you, everything is fine in today's world. And, at least in Russia, I think this is the best result. Any war is a tragedy. The Second World War was a tragedy as well. But as a German, I have the opportunity to study in Russia. It seems to me that this is the best result. We should thank the veterans because it was they who liberated Germany from fascism. I am very glad to come here to Russia. I am glad to come to Kursk to learn more not only about the Battle of Kursk, but about the Great Patriotic War. Despite the fact that it was the great tragedy. I believe that it is our shared history that unites Germany and Russia. It seems to me that our peoples are much closer and more similar to each other than to other peoples. As a result, there is peace in both Germany and Russia. The most important thing is that we really remember what happened and will do everything to prevent it from happening again.